Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where forgotten tales of America's past are brought back to life. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our nation's history. Now, let us take you back in time to a tale of love, obsession, and tragedy unlike any other. The story begins in the rural South of the early 1800s, when America was still a land divided not only by geography, but by the very soul of its people. Towns were small, churches were the heart of community life, and slavery was not only legal, but woven into the fabric of daily existence. In that time, a man's reputation was everything, and for a preacher, his moral standing was his livelihood. Yet behind the polished sermons, the carefully chosen Bible verses, and the stern yet fatherly demeanor, there were secrets that could unravel everything. Reverend Thomas Whitfield was a man who carried both authority and burden. Born into a modest family in Virginia, he had risen through education and the grace of his congregation to become a respected minister in a small southern town. People admired his devotion, his powerful voice on Sunday mornings, and the way he seemed to shepherd not just the spiritual lives of his flock, but their everyday struggles as well. He preached often about family, loyalty, the sanctity of marriage, and the dangers of temptation. To the community, he was an anchor of morality, a man whose word carried weight. Yet, behind the closed doors of the Whitfield home, things were not as they appeared. His marriage to Sarah, a stern woman of proud lineage, was more arrangement than affection. Sarah came from a wealthy planter family and brought with her both land and slaves. To the Reverend, marrying her had secured not only a steady household, but also a certain respectability that allowed him to grow his ministry. But love, real love, was absent from their union. Sarah was a woman of duty, not warmth, and while she maintained the house and upheld appearances, she rarely offered her husband tenderness. Their conversations were practical, their silences heavy. On the Whitfield property lived many enslaved people, men and women who labored in the fields, tended the animals, and cared for the house. Among them was a young woman named Eliza. She had been born into bondage, her mother having served Sarah's family before her. Eliza was striking not only for her beauty, but for her quiet intelligence. Her eyes, dark and steady, seemed to see more than most, and she carried herself with a dignity that unsettled some and fascinated others. She was often chosen to help within the house rather than in the fields, and so she came into frequent contact with the Reverend at first. Their interactions were ordinary, the simple exchanges of a master and servant in a household governed by rigid boundaries. But over time, something began to stir. The Reverend, who had long felt starved of affection, noticed Eliza's gentleness, the way she listened with genuine interest when he spoke, the way her laughter rare but sincere softened the heavy air of the house. She, in turn, saw in him a man who, despite his authority, carried a loneliness that mirrored her own. It began in small moments. A longer glance, a word spoken more softly than required, the passing of a handkerchief during a hot summer day. For Eliza, it was dangerous to feel anything for him. For the Reverend, it was sinful, forbidden, and yet irresistible. The tension of those unspoken feelings grew until it could no longer be denied. One evening, when the house was quiet and Sarah had retired early, the Reverend lingered near the kitchen where Eliza was cleaning. He found himself unable to walk away, compelled by something beyond reason. He spoke to her, not as a master to a slave, not as a preacher to a congregant, but as a man to a woman. In the stillness of that night, the walls of duty, law, and faith crumbled. Their connection crossed into a realm both tender and perilous. For the Reverend, Eliza filled the void that his marriage had left barren. He found in her warmth, affection, and the sense of being truly seen. For Eliza, Bound by chains she had not chosen, the attention of the Reverend was both a curse and a kind of fragile salvation. It was dangerous, yes, but in a world where she had so little control over her own life, these stolen moments gave her something like freedom. But love of this kind could not remain hidden forever. The Reverend grew careless, his longing too strong to conceal. He found excuses to keep Eliza near, to have her accompany him on errands, to linger in conversation. Sarah, sharp-eyed and proud, began to notice. At first it was suspicion, then anger, and finally a cold certainty. She saw the way her husband looked at the girl, the way Eliza lowered her eyes not in fear, but in something else. For Sarah, it was not only betrayal of marriage, but humiliation. In the strict social order of the South, to be replaced in affection by a slave was an insult beyond bearing. She confronted her husband in hushed, furious tones, reminding him of his duty, his reputation, his sermons. The Reverend, torn between shame and longing, tried to dismiss it, to assure her it was nothing. But Sarah knew better. Meanwhile, whispers began to stir among the enslaved people. Nothing stayed secret for long on a plantation. Servants saw the glances, heard the footsteps at odd hours, noticed when the Reverend's hand brushed against Eliza's too long. To them, it was not shocking. Many masters took liberties with the women they owned, but this felt different. This was not simply lust. This was something deeper, more dangerous. The Reverend, it seemed, loved Eliza more than he loved his own. Wife. Such a truth was a powder keg waiting to ignite. For in a society built on rigid control, any affection that blurred the line between master and slave threatened the entire system. And as the Reverend's obsession grew, the danger drew closer. What began as a secret comfort was soon to spiral into something darker. The Reverend's heart was no longer his own, and neither was Eliza's. But in the world they lived in, love came at a terrible price. And that price, as they would soon discover, was death itself. The days and weeks that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. The Reverend, who once preached against temptation with fire in his voice, now stood at his pulpit carrying a weight that seemed to crush him. His words still rolled across the congregation, but behind them was a man at war with himself. When he spoke of sin, he thought of Eliza. When he spoke of loyalty, he thought of Sarah. And when he spoke of God's love, he felt the painful contradiction of his own heart. But feelings, as dangerous as his, could not remain confined. They began to seep into his life like water into cracked stone. His sermons grew uneven, sometimes passionate, sometimes distracted. Parishioners noticed the strain in his eyes, though none could name its cause. Sarah grew colder still, her glances sharp, her voice clipped. She held her silence in public, but behind closed doors, the air between them was poisoned. Eliza bore the weight most of all. For her, every glance from the Reverend was both balm and burden. She knew the risk, knew the danger of being seen as anything more than a servant. Yet in his presence, she felt human in a way the world never allowed her. That recognition was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying, because she knew what happened to women in her position. When secrets were revealed, whispers had already begun to curl around the household. A stable hand swore. He saw the Reverend brush Eliza's arm by the well. A maid claimed she heard hushed voices in the night. These whispers carried beyond the enslaved quarters, drifting through kitchens, through gardens, until finally they reached the ears of townsfolk. Nothing moved faster in a small southern town than gossip, and soon there were mutters in the pews, careful questions exchanged after service. The Reverend seems troubled. "Have you noticed the girl, Eliza? Always near the house? Do you think?" The Reverend sensed it. He felt the eyes of his congregation upon him, sharper than before, watching for cracks in the holy man's mask. Yet instead of pulling away, he found himself pulled deeper in. He sought Eliza's presence more boldly now, asking her to read. To him in the evenings, under the pretense of teaching her letters, a scandalous kindness in itself. He justified it to himself as charity, as Christian duty. But his heart knew the truth. It was not her learning he cared for, but her nearness. For Sarah, each of these moments was a wound that cut deeper than the last. She had been raised in a world where a woman's value was tied to her husband's. Fidelity, her social standing, and her ability to command respect. To be publicly humiliated, to be made a fool in the eyes of the community, was a fate worse than loneliness. And so her heart hardened into something cruel. She spoke less to her husband and more to her family, her brothers, and the neighbors, who shared her outrage. She whispered her suspicions to them, laying the groundwork for what would become her vengeance. One evening, when the air was thick with the heat of summer and the cicadas hummed outside, Sarah confronted her husband again. Her voice was low, controlled, but her words were knives. She accused him plainly of shame, of betrayal, of making her into an object of ridicule. She demanded he put an end to it, that he sell Eliza, that he rid himself of the temptation and restore their household's dignity. The Reverend's reply was not what she expected. His face, pale and strained, did not carry the usual weight of authority. Instead, he spoke with a desperation that startled her. He refused. He told her he could not bear to part with Eliza, that the girl meant more to him than Sarah could ever understand. In that moment, the truth was laid bare, and Sarah saw with cold clarity that her husband did not merely lust after Eliza, he loved her. That night marked a shift. The Reverend had crossed a line from which he could never return. His marriage, though still intact in form, was shattered in spirit. His congregation, though still respectful, had begun to question in silence. And the enslaved people who worked his land knew that their master's heart was bound to one of their own, a bond both tender and doomed. As the summer turned to autumn, events grew darker. Sarah's resentment hardened into planning. She began to visit her family's plantation more often, speaking with her brothers in tones too quiet to overhear. The Reverend noticed her absences, but did not ask. He was too consumed with Eliza, too entangled in his own forbidden happiness, to see the danger gathering around him. Meanwhile, Eliza lived each day with a trembling awareness of what could come. She had not chosen this path. How could she? Yet, she was bound to it all the same. She felt both cherished and endangered, caught in the web of a man's obsession that she could neither escape nor fully embrace. For though she cared for the Reverend, her life was not her own to risk. She belonged to him by law, and the world would never see their bond as love, only as scandal, only as sin. And so the stage was set. A Reverend torn between his vows and his heart, a wife humiliated and burning for revenge, a young woman trapped between the chains of slavery and the chains of love. The small town watching, whispering, waiting for the secret to break into the open. The tragedy that would follow was no longer a question of if but when. The cool air of autumn brought little peace to the Whitfield household. The Reverend, though still standing tall in the pulpit each Sunday, carried the wear of sleepless nights on his face. His congregation whispered more openly now. Women nudged each other in the pews. Men exchanged glances of disapproval. Some believed Sarah's quiet fury had justification. Others defended the Reverend, unwilling to believe a man of God could stray so far. But no one ignored the story anymore. In small towns of the South, gossip was more powerful than law, and it spread like wildfire. Every look, every pause in conversation, every trip Eliza made into town under the Reverend's instruction became another brick in the wall of suspicion. His enemies, those who envied his voice, his authority, or his hold over the community. Found new fuel. Even friends began to turn cautious, distancing themselves from the man who seemed to love a slave more than his own wife. Sarah's silence grew more dangerous than her words. She no longer argued with her husband, no longer pleaded or threatened. Instead, she moved with the deliberate calm of a woman who had decided upon something terrible. She spoke in hushed tones to her brothers, men who carried the old Southern pride like a shield, men who believed honor was defended, not with words, but with action. They heard her humiliation, and to them, it was an insult that could not be ignored. Eliza lived in constant dread. Though the Reverend assured her he would protect her, she knew protection was an illusion. She had seen women whipped, sold, or worse for far less than what she now carried upon her shoulders. Her life was not her own, and her choices mattered little against the tide of resentment swelling around her. Yet still, in the quiet hours when the Reverend spoke softly to her, she felt a fragile kind of peace, as though love might shield them from the cruelty of the world. But deep inside, she knew the truth no shield could hold forever. The breaking point came on a night in late November. A town gathering had been called, a dinner held in the hall beside the church. Families brought food, children played outside, and conversations buzzed beneath the glow of lantern light. The Reverend stood among his flock, speaking kindly, offering blessings, forcing smiles that did not reach his weary eyes. Sarah remained at his side, her face stern and unreadable. Eliza, as a house servant, moved quietly through the crowd, pouring drinks, clearing plates. It was there, under the watchful eyes of the entire town, that the mask cracked. The Reverend, forgetting himself, spoke to Eliza too warmly, lingered too near, his gaze holding hers a moment too long. It was subtle, but it was enough. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Conversations faltered, glances darted, and Sarah's lips tightened into a thin, unforgiving line. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into certainties. The town no longer asked if it declared that the Reverend had disgraced himself. Parishioners visited Sarah with pity in their voices. Some confronted the Reverend directly, urging him to repent, to sell the girl, to cleanse himself of the sin before he lost everything. But the Reverend, caught between guilt and passion, could not yield. He told them God's love was vast enough to forgive even this, that his heart was no longer his to command. These words only deepened the outrage. Sarah's family acted swiftly. One evening, while the Reverend was away tending to a sick parishioner, her brothers came to the Whitfield home. They dragged Eliza from her quarters, their hands rough, their faces twisted with rage. To them, she was not a woman, but the source of their sister's humiliation, the stain upon their family name. Eliza pleaded, her voice trembling, but her cries found no mercy. They beat her, threatened to sell her deep into the South, far from anyone she knew. They swore that if the Reverend dared defy them, he would share in her fate. When the Reverend returned and found Eliza bloodied and trembling, something inside him broke. He fell to his knees beside her, weeping, not as a preacher, but as a man stripped bare of pretense. He cursed Sarah's brothers, cursed the laws of man that allowed such cruelty. In his fury, he declared that he would never give Eliza up, that he would rather burn his marriage, his reputation, even his soul, than lose her. From that moment forward, he ceased pretending. He no longer tried to hide his love. He defied Sarah openly, dismissing her rage. He spoke of Eliza as if she were his equal, a partner rather than property. To the enslaved people of the household, it was shocking, unheard of. To the town, it was blasphemy, the undoing of everything they believed kept order. And so the Reverend became a man marked. His sermons were poorly attended. Some congregants refused to return at all. The town council met in secret, speaking of removing him from his post. Sarah, humiliated beyond repair, whispered to her brothers that her husband was lost, that his sin had consumed him entirely. And Eliza, though cherished by the Reverend's love, lived in constant terror of what vengeance might yet fall upon them. The walls were closing in. The Reverend's defiance had left him isolated, his wife burning with vengeance, his community turning their backs, and Eliza at the center of a storm she had never asked for. The path ahead was narrowing, leading toward a single tragic end. The obsession that bound them together had become a fire too fierce to control, and soon it would consume them all. The winter winds came harsh and early that year, sweeping through the small southern town with a chill that seemed to echo the coldness in the Reverend's life. By then, his downfall was nearly complete. The church that had once hung on his every word now stood half empty on Sundays. Men who had once shaken his hand with respect now looked away when they passed him on the road. The town's children, who once greeted him with eager smiles, were pulled aside by their mothers, warned not to speak too freely near the disgraced preacher. Sarah no longer wore the mask of a dutiful wife. Her contempt showed plainly in the coldness of her voice and the disdain in her eyes. She no longer cared if the world saw her hatred. To her, her husband was not only unfaithful, but an enemy who had dragged her family's name through the mud. The shame of being compared to a slave woman in her own home was unbearable, and she sharpened her grief into vengeance. The Reverend, blinded by his love for Eliza, did not retreat. If anything, he pressed further, speaking of her openly within the house, eating meals in her presence, seeking her company as though the opinions of others no longer mattered. He had convinced himself that love, true love, was worth the loss of reputation, worth the wrath of his wife, even worth the judgment of his congregation. But he was mistaken in believing that love could shield them from the world's cruelty. The end began on a bitter evening in January. Sarah's brothers returned, their boots crunching in the frozen dirt as they approached the Whitfield house. They had come before with warnings and threats, but this time their faces bore no patience. They demanded Eliza be sold immediately, sent away where she could never again disgrace their family. The Reverend, standing tall in his doorway, refused them with a fury that shocked even himself. He shouted that they had no right, that Eliza was his and would remain his, that he loved her and would never let her go. His words were not the voice of a cautious preacher. They were the desperate cry of a man undone. And those words sealed his fate. That night, while the house lay in uneasy silence, the brothers returned under cover of darkness. They stormed the quarters where Eliza slept, dragging her from her bed. She fought, her screams tearing through the cold night, waking the Reverend from his restless sleep. He rushed down the stairs, his heart pounding, and found himself face to face with Sarah's kin. What followed was chaos. The Reverend, consumed by desperation, threw himself at the men. Fists flew, voices roared, the sound of struggle echoing against the wooden walls. But 3 against 1 was no fight at all. They beat him to the ground, their rage fueled not only by his defiance, but by what they saw as his betrayal of race, family, and faith. Eliza, screaming through her tears, tried to shield him, but she was thrown aside. The Reverend rose again, bloodied but unbroken, and shouted words that stunned them all. I would rather die beside her than live without her. And so they gave him what he declared. By the time the struggle ended, the Reverend lay broken on the floor, his body battered, his breath shallow. The men, panting and furious, dragged Eliza away into the night. Whether she was sold to another plantation, hidden away, or worse, no record remained clear. Her name vanished from the town's memory, whispered only in secret by the enslaved, who mourned her absence. The Reverend lingered only a short while longer. Some say Sarah stood over him as his life slipped away, her face cold as stone. Others whispered she turned her back, leaving him to fade alone in the silence of his ruined home. What is certain is that he died that night, not as a man of God, respected by his flock, but as a man broken by his own forbidden love. When dawn came, the town awoke to the scandal fully exposed. The church bells rang not for service, but for mourning. Some called it justice, saying the reverend had paid for his sin. Others, softer in their judgment, pitied him, a man who had been caught between duty and desire, between law and love, and who had chosen the path that could only lead to ruin. Sarah remained in the house, her pride intact, but her heart hollow. Her brothers walked tall in town, unashamed of what they had done, believing they had defended honor. And the townsfolk moved on, folding the story into their history like another cautionary tale. But among the enslaved, the story of Eliza and the Reverend lived on longer. They spoke of it in whispers by the fire, of the preacher who had loved one of their own more than he loved his own wife, more than he loved his own life. It was a story of sorrow, but also of the strange, fragile power of love, a power that could pierce even the cruelest chains, even if only for a moment. In the end, the Reverend's obsession was both his salvation and his destruction. He had sought in Eliza the warmth and tenderness his world had denied him, and though it cost him everything, he clung to it until his final breath. His death became not just a scandal, but a legend, a reminder of the dangerous, uncontrollable force of love in a world built on oppression and control. And so his story lived on, whispered through generations, remembered not for the sermons he preached, but for the love that consumed him and the tragic, unimaginable end it brought.